Well, it's a real pleasure to see so many of you here today for our distinguished lecturer in the middle of International Week. Before I make the introductions, just so you know, this session is being webcast and taped, and during the Q&A at the end of our speaker's presentation, the microphones in front of you will be on. They're not on at the moment, but they will be on. And this means that anything that you say or do will be webcast around the world. What an opportunity. But also a moment of caution. It's truly a pleasure to introduce James Joseph to you. Ambassador Joseph is the former United States ambassador to South Africa. He served in South Africa from 1996 to 1999, and he was awarded the South African Order of Good Hope, which is the highest honor that the Republic of South Africa bestows on a citizen of another country. He was the first U.S. ambassador to present his credentials to President Nelson Mandela. Ambassador Joseph is someone who was in South Africa at the most important time, I think, in that country's history. And that's just part of what he's done. He has served 4 United States presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, in different capacities. He has taught at Yale Divinity School and at the Claremont Colleges. He was president of the Cummins Engine Foundation, a serious businessman as well. And now we have the great privilege at Duke University to have him here as a professor of the practice of public policy studies at the building across the street. I don't think he needs any more introduction than that. Ambassador Joseph, you tell me that the title of your talk today is The Lure of Empire, the Role of the United States in the World. You also tell me that you'll speak for approximately 25 minutes and then take questions and discussion. We have just a little bit over an hour's time. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Welcome to Duke Law School.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I talk to a lot of groups at a lot of places, so listening to introductions is one of my favorite pastimes. Actually, I was once in the South Pacific when I was in the Carter administration to swear in the newly elected governor, and I was invited afterwards to speak to a joint session of the legislature. And just before I was scheduled to speak, I leaned over to the speaker and I said, how long do I have to speak? And he said, Mr. Undersecretary, you are our guest. You may speak as long as you wish, but I must caution you that in about 25 minutes, the lights are scheduled to go off across the island. So I've sort of become 25-minute oriented. I'm delighted that you have given some thought to the interconnectedness and interdependence of our world. This is a time of great opportunity, but it is also a time of tremendous challenge and even danger for both today's leaders and the leaders in the next generation. I want, therefore, to talk to you about the role of the United States in the new world as we know it, rather than the old world as we romanticize it. I want to do so by offering 4 general observations about, first, the lingering deficits in democracy, secondly, the changing nature of power, third, the increasing influence of civil society, and finally, the challenge of globalization. An editor of the Atlanta Constitution warned recently in an article of the lure of empire, noting that the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of the Soviet Union had essentially laid a global empire at the feet of the United States, he emphasized 3 points. First, the American people have never been comfortable with the thought of our nation as a new Rome. And second, there has always been those who harbored secret thoughts that a global empire might indeed be our destiny. And third, the events of September 11th gave the advocates of empire an opportunity to press their case. Now, others speak not so much of the lure of empire as the triumph of the ideas trumpeted by American democracy. Michael Mandelbaum, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, has just published a book in which he celebrates 3 ideas that conventional wisdom suggests have conquered the world: peace, democracy, and free markets. His thesis has been endorsed by some of the most respected names in the foreign policy establishment as the triumph of the Woodrow Wilson triad. But while it is true that no major ideology is challenging capitalism, and many old and new societies now see democracy as the optimal way to organize political life, I would begin by offering several cautions about lingering deficits in democracy. First, the idea of democracy has been romanticized as a political system in which the people have the power. But in many countries, it has come to mean that the people have the vote, which is not always the same thing as having the power. Even some of the liberation groups that have come to power in recent years, committed to democracy, have found that they have gained power at a time in which the many international forces at play make it difficult for them to deliver on the expectation that the turn to democracy would lead to a more equitable society. Now, it is time for us to face squarely the fact that democracy in much of the developing world has not had an impressive record in alleviating poverty. In a paper presented to a conference on world development sponsored by the UK government and Sussex University, Ashutosh Varshney, a professor at the University of Notre Dame, argues that over the last 4 or 5 decades, some countries with authoritarian rule have almost entirely removed poverty from their midst. But while democracies have often prevented the worst-case scenarios from happening, they have not always achieved the best results. Now, many of us can probably give our own reasons for the failure of particular democracies. But the truth remains that democracies do not de facto eliminate poverty. Economic strategies do. And that is why support for democracy must include support to empower the poor to be active participants in their own development. We have all too often asked the wrong questions in dealing with poverty. We've usually asked, what can we do about the poor? Or what can we do for the poor? The question we must ask is, what can we do in partnership with the poor? What can we do together? Experience around the world seems to demonstrate that when the poor are included and when grassroots energies are mobilized, we have not only wider ownership of strategies, but we also have new ideas. It is now clear that democracy is strengthened when the poor are engaged in some form of participatory development or assisted self-reliance, rather than isolated forms of self-help that assumes that people with no boots can somehow lift themselves by their own bootstraps. A second deficit in the advance of democracy is the assumption that turning to democracy will mean the elimination of poverty. We have all too often, as I said, asked the wrong question, but Bishop Desmond Tutu, in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness, suggests that the whole process of reconciliation and stability has been placed in considerable jeopardy by the enormous disparities between the rich, mainly the whites, and the poor, mainly the blacks. He goes on to say that unless houses replace the hovels and shacks in which most blacks live in South Africa, unless blacks gain access to clean water, electricity, affordable health care, decent education, good jobs, and a safe environment, things which a vast majority of whites have, we can just as well kiss reconciliation goodbye. Now, what about the celebration of the advance of capitalism? Just a few years ago, many people in many places who were once critical of business concluded that markets were good for democracy and democracy good for markets. But the remarkable endorsement of this particular way of organizing the creation of wealth was tempered by the expectation that business would solve social problems, meet social needs, and operate by acceptable standards of ethics and corporate responsibility. A new realism is dawning, not just in the United States, but abroad as well, that on all these fronts, business has not met the expectation of many of its most enthusiastic converts. While the extent to which capitalism took root in South Africa surprised many observers who thought that Marx's ideology might prevail, there was a strong effort to ensure that market reforms and empowerment strategies reflected South Africa's unique situation. No South African could simply say that we are going to do it as they do it in the West. It had to look South African, and it had to be South African before that could be South African endorsement or South African ownership. In that regard, South Africans reflect the new reality of the developing world. Even the countries most desirous of endorsement and inclusion in the capitalist and democratic system, those countries most desirous of organizing the creation of wealth in this way have been tempered by the expectation that business would solve social problems and the disappointment that is not. The same can be said about democracy in terms of its ownership. When I first went to South Africa as ambassador, they were writing a new constitution. There were many people in the United States who were not simply pleased, particularly in Washington, who were not simply pleased with the fact that they were turning to democracy. They were disappointed that they were not turning to American-style democracy. Party partisans in the United States who fight mightily for effective control of the Congress and the country wanted me to do something about the fact that the ANC was so popular at the polls. I wanted to see a strong private sector, a strong civil society, and a public sector with multiple parties where the people decide which party must represent their interests. They, on the other hand, wanted to help develop strong opposition parties, regardless of the will of the people. Well, enough about deficits in democracy. A word about the changing nature of power. And here I refer to the change in the unipolar dominance of the United States. There is a widening debate about whether the kind of world we seek is best achieved by flexing our military or economic muscle, or has the time come for the wise and prudent use of what is now called soft power. The notion of soft power is increasingly used to refer to the ability to attract and influence through the flow of information, the appeal of social, cultural, and moral messages, and the examples set by acts of generosity. As Professor Joseph Nye at the Kennedy School put it, hard power is the ability to get others to do what we want. Soft power is the ability to get others to want the same things we do. The former is based on coercion, and the latter is based on attraction and affinity. I saw the impact of soft power firsthand during my tenure as United States Ambassador to South Africa. For Nelson Mandela represented the epitome of soft power. His moral standing and his political stature in the world went far beyond that suggested by the size of South Africa's GNP or the size of its military. His influence came from the power of his humanity. It came from the elegance of his spirit. It came from his willingness to seek reconciliation. Among the many lessons we should have learned from the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela is the fact that democracy or diplomacy increasingly depends on a moral ecology that cannot be found exclusively in military or economic power. Former President Jimmy Carter was recently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because of the example he has set in the use and impact of soft power. Like Mandela, he has gained the admiration and confidence of the world community, not simply because of his engagement in their needs, but because he does so in such a way as to help people help themselves. Like Mandela, his standing and stature comes not from economic or military power, but because of his willingness to respect local cultures, because of his willingness to honor local traditions, and to elevate local aspiration, even as he seeks to introduce new ways of thinking and new ways of being. Now, the irony is that the American engagement with the world is that until recently, we were well set to use soft power to ensure peaceful and a secure global community. The Agency for International Development and the United States Information Service Agency were key vehicles for the expression of American ideals, generosity, and respect for the peoples of the world. But with half of the 6 billion people on Earth living on $2 a day, 1/3 not connected to any energy system, and 1/4 lacking any clean water, Americans, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, are spending less than half of what we spent a decade earlier to help the world's poor. The United States gives less than 1/10% of the gross domestic product for non-military foreign aid. But according to public opinion polls, the public perception is that foreign assistance is about 15%. At the same time, according to the same polls, Americans believe that foreign assistance would be right at about 5%. Why then, in an era of soft power, are we seeking a 1/10% solution to the problems of an interdependent world, when the American people would obviously be willing to do more if they knew more? We hear frequently that foreign assistance has largely failed. Yet, it is in a large part due to foreign aid that the world literacy rate rose by nearly 50% in the last third of the 20th century. Infant mortality rate was cut in half. Life expectancy tripled. And 71 nations became free or partly free, primarily because of foreign assistance. Now, some critics of development aid even suggest that most countries receiving American assistance are poorer now than they were 25 years ago. The senior senator from North Carolina is fond of saying that. And he usually cites countries like Somalia, Sierra Leone, Burundi, Rwanda, and Liberia, all countries in Africa, as examples. But this distorts the success stories in at least two important ways. First, the amount of assistance to these countries pales compared to aid bestowed upon other countries like Egypt, Israel, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and others that are pointed to as success stories. Secondly, the countries in Africa that have been notorious failures have been largely bypassed by the mushrooming floors of private investment that have offset the decline of foreign aid in other regions, such as East Asia and Latin America. And third, you cannot give the poor money with one hand and take back this same money in debt with the other hand, and somehow assume that you're helping to eliminate or alleviate poverty. Why is the United States so generous domestically and so stingy abroad when borders no longer create or confine community? While at the turn of the century we had enjoyed one of our most prosperous decades ever, our nation also set a record for stinginess abroad. Never has the United States given a smaller share of its money to help the world's poor. We now spend less than half of what we spent a decade ago as a proportion of our GDP. In fact, the United States gives less foreign aid than any of the other industrialized nations, proportionate to the size of its economy. The top 5 donor countries at the dawn of the new millennium were Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, and Luxembourg. The United States ranks 21st. Now, I'm making this point because I hope that those of you who are concerned about the declining image of the United States in the world will help make the case to policymakers and opinion leaders for development aid. The need for a new constituency comes not simply from the decline in the amount we give, but it comes from changes in the understanding of the nature of development. While I respect the integrity of those who've suggested that the work of development be transferred to faith-based charities, it is critical that Americans understand the distinction between charity and development. While charity plays a significant role in the life of a community or society, we must nevertheless ask, is foreign aid to be primarily charity, providing food for those suffering from famine, water for those suffering from drought, medical aid for those suffering from disease, and relief for earthquake victims? Or is the emphasis also to be placed on development, helping people learn to grow their own food, helping people to drill for water, helping people to prevent diseases, and support the development of democratic pluralism? That is really the issue posed by those who would abolish the Agency for International Development and replace it with a foundation that would hand out block grants to private relief and faith-based charities. Thanks to pages of congressionally mandated regulations, any one of us who've spent any time abroad are aware of problems with the way in which AID, the Agency for International Development, operates and delivers aid. But the need is to reform present practices, not to abolish present institutions. And here I've been pleased with the approach taken by Secretary of State Colin Powell in seeking increases in foreign aid as an essential part of American diplomacy and security. But he's been so preoccupied of late with other issues that those obsessed with hard power, that I fear that they have the potential for minimizing the importance of soft power. Now, a third challenge to the dominance of any one nation state is the increasing influence of civil society. It is important, even critical, that we hold the state responsible for playing a lead role in the exercise of soft power. But its effectiveness will be greatly diminished if it is asked to do so unilaterally rather than in partnership with the other sectors. We're accustomed to thinking of democratic society as divided between three sectors: a public sector driven by the ballot, a private sector driven by markets, and a third or social sector driven by voluntarism, private giving, and institutions of civil society. But while we must do what we can to ensure that the private sector has the commitment and the public sector the capacity to play a meaningful role, it is only through partnerships between all three sectors that we're able to generate sufficient resources to tackle significant problems. While serving as ambassador, I was asked occasionally why, as a representative of government, I was so high on civil society. The answer is very simple. Civil society occupies a middle ground between the government and the private sector. It shares with government a sense of the public good, but it is not dependent on a political mandate and functions best when it is community or need-driven. It is public without the need for consensus, and it is private without being self-serving. People around the world are coming to realize that a good society depends as much on the goodness of individuals as it does on the soundness of government and the fairness of laws. For a while, we thought we could find common ground in the political culture, with its emphasis on the ballot and the emergence of new democracies. Later, we thought we could find common ground in the economic culture, with its emphasis on markets and the ties created by an interdependent world economy. Increasingly, it appears that we find common ground not so much in the political or economic culture, but we find it in the emergence of a new civic culture with its emphasis on civil society and its ability to bring people together to participate in their own development. What the poor need is not simply charity, but participatory development, the kind of support that helps people to help themselves. I have found over the years that when neighbors help neighbors, and even when strangers help strangers, both those who help and those who are helped are transformed. I found that when that which was considered their problem becomes our problem, a new relationship is established and a new forms of community are possible. So we come finally to the fifth challenge I want to refer to, the fourth challenge rather, and that is the challenge of globalization. It begins first with the fear of globalization. We need to understand that many who reject globalization do so because they see it as essentially Americanization. Protesters from Seattle to Beijing have denounced what they see as the disastrous effects of globalization on the fragile economies of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. At the United Nations Conference on Racism in Durban, it was described as a way of promoting and perpetuating the prejudices and intolerances of Western society. A recent international review of culture and society even cited Hollywood's dominance of international cinema as a major culprit in shaping public opinion and cultural values around the world. It seems that American movies account for more than 70% of films that are seen in other countries, in most of Western Europe in particular, and have a 90% share of the market in those countries. It's not surprising then that critical observers have suggested recently that if poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world in the early 19th century, that role has passed to filmmakers in the 21st century. Should we fear globalization? Obviously not. Should we be concerned about globalization? Yes. Kofi Annan argues that the poor are poor not because of too much globalization, but because of too little, because they're not a part of it, because they are excluded. It is easy to observe from an American perspective the benefits of the global flow of capital, technology, and people. It is easy for us as Americans to see the advantage of eliminating barriers to trade and travel. But the voices proclaiming the dangers of globalization are getting louder and more disturbing. The increasing discontent falls into two basic categories. The first involves the political and economic downside of globalization for developing countries. The financial volatility evident in the crisis a few years ago that led to severe recession in some countries and an increase in inequality within and among countries. Another category of discontent with globalization involves a crisis of expectation. Many of the new leaders of emerging democracies began their preparation for the assumption of power at a time when it was assumed that nation states, including developing nations, could manage their economies in ways that brought the benefits of a market economy to all of their people. As they came into power, however, they found that the ground had shifted and their economies were greatly affected by outside forces they could not control. In the end, no nation can avoid the challenge of globalization. But while we embrace the advantages it offers, we will need to help ease the anxieties it generates. And so, finally, the lure of empire is indeed a powerful impulse. But those who would make that decision should make it knowing that the price of maintaining an empire is high and the moral legitimacy difficult to defend. The kind of world that we should want, the kind of world that we should help to build, was described by the black mystic, poet, and theologian Howard Thurman some years ago, who was fond of saying, "I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you. I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you." As Americans, we need to be able to say, "I want to be an American without making it difficult for Africans to be Africans, Asians to be Asians, and Arabs to be Arabs." It is to be able to say, "I want to be a Muslim without making it difficult for Christians to be Christians, Buddhists to be Buddhists, and Jews to be Jews." That is the sort of discernment that should be reflected in the engagement of the United States with the rest of the world. It is perfectly legitimate and morally valid that we should seek security in the dangerous world we now live. But this will be difficult as long as the richest 20% of the global population receives more than 80% of the global income. Security will be difficult as long as the average income for the richest 20 countries is 37 times the average for the poorest 20, a gap that has more than doubled in the past 40 years. Security will be difficult as long as 1.2 billion people still live under less than $1 a day and 2.8 billion still live on less than $2 a day. As Jim Wolferson, the president of the World Bank, put it, the conflicts that now plague our world are not merely accidents of history. With all the forces making our world smaller, it is time to change our way of thinking. It is time to realize that we live together in one world, not two. Time to realize that the fight against poverty, racism, and marginalization is the fight for global peace and global security. It is time to realize that we have a historic opportunity that we dare not allow to pass us by. Thank you.
As I mentioned, Ambassador Joseph would like to have questions and like to have a discussion. While you're thinking of those questions, I want to add a little bit more to the introduction I gave at the beginning. Let there be no doubt that Ambassador Joseph practices what he preaches. When as a young man he was a civil rights activist in Alabama, he was practicing what he preaches. And most recently, here at Duke, in Durham, and in South Africa, he has established an independent center on leadership and public values, which is directed at helping emerging leaders in Southern Africa contribute to the development and reconstruction of their countries and their region. This is a man who gets things done. He means what he says. Questions, please.
What is your views on the land redistribution process in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, and the violence that's going on in South Africa?
Well, let me separate those questions. What is going on in Zimbabwe cannot be defended. Mr. Mugabe has chosen ways to do land distribution that are antithetical to the democracy he helped to spawn. Here's a man who made tremendous contributions in the early years as leader of Zimbabwe. As some of you know, they have a tremendous educational system. There are many other things for which he should be taken credit. But unfortunately, in his later years, he has chosen not to redistribute land by the support that was offered by Britain and the United States to buy land that could be distributed, but to allow the veterans to take the land violently. That can't be defended. And it has a major impact on South Africa, its neighbor, where many people are leaving Zimbabwe to try and find work in South Africa because the Zimbabwean economy has crumbled. Now, the question you ask about violence in South Africa, most of you may not know that last night there were 10 bombs that went off in South Africa, 9 of them in the township of Soweto. There are some people, small steerings on the right, who harbor notions that somehow they could return apartheid. It's ludicrous. These folks are marginal and therefore have no chance of taking South Africa back to where it was. But it turns out that 12 to 13 people were engaged in a plot to try to do this, and they were arrested. And they are now under arrest. And as a result of that, it seemed that some group decided last night to try and demonstrate that they still had some power. One person was killed and another critically injured. My sense is that the idea of a right-wing overthrow of South Africa is ludicrous. The government is firmly entrenched. There is a firm allegiance to democratic institutions, and that means a strong parliament, a strong judiciary system, and whereas there's vigorous political debate in the parliament, the one thing on which there's great agreement is that South Africa should be a multiracial society of the kind that's now being developed. And so, yes, there was violence. I called South Africa just before coming here to find out as much as I could. And the person I called didn't even know that there had been bombings in his country last night. So I will call the State Department when I leave here to get further briefing.
Do you agree that land ownership and development is key to participatory development?
Oh, when I talk about the poor, obviously, when you talk about countries in Africa, let's talk about Southern Africa, the land was taken away from them illegally. And when Bishop Desmond Tutu talks about there cannot be reconciliation until there's some form of restitution, it means the restitution of land as well. In South Africa, they have an orderly system. And you may know that District 6, which is in Cape Town, which was taken from the group of people who are so-called coloreds, has now been returned to the former inhabitants of District 6. So there's some progress being made on land distribution, but in the democratic process, it's slow. And I hope the people will have the patience to let this happen orderly rather than to try and turn to the methods that are used in Zimbabwe. But I completely agree with you that you can't really have an authentic and genuine democracy. You can't really have peace and tranquility and security unless some of that land that was illegally taken from the people is restored. But you know, that's not peculiarly South African problems. One of the positions I held in government was that of the Deputy Secretary, at that time called the Undersecretary of the Department of Interior. One of the departments reporting to me was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And during my tenure in the Carter administration, the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Penobscot tribe in the state of Maine filed suit seeking a return of the state of Maine to those two tribes. Now, it turns out that there was a treaty with those two tribes and that legally that land belongs to the Native Americans who used to inhabit it. But there have been several generations of Americans who have received title to the land on which they now sit, and they build homes and businesses. And so you cannot really return that land in mass to the two tribes. And so we worked out an agreement in which we provided them 400,000 acres of forest and I think $100 million. And it was a compromise that we settled out of court. But among the pending litigation in the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs are many land claim suits because of land that was taken away from the Native Americans illegally. And so democracies have got to find some way of redressing a problem which occurred in some cases hundreds and several hundreds of years ago. But they have to find an equitable way of redressing them within the context of today's democratic systems. Yes.
Ambassador Joseph, in regards to Zimbabwe, I mean, the situation seems to be where, I don't know if it's Mugabe's personal interest, or it seems like to me that anybody that's in his position, based on that swell of, the reclamation of the lands, I'm just wondering, from your opinion, how do you think that situation would actually change, where there would be some process or some way that there wouldn't be the violent taking of the land, where it would be an orderly process that goes through government?
Well, what was discussed almost a decade ago with Mugabe was the possibility of foreign assistance, particularly from the United States and Britain, that would provide a pool of money for him to buy back land and to redistribute it. He never embarked on that process. And as a matter of fact, it was an issue that was forgotten until several years ago when he decided he wanted to run for re-election again. And then he, when questioned about it, he said, well, they weren't serious. But he never sought to find out whether or not they were serious and whether or not he could have gotten that money. And he let land distribution go as a cause until time came for re-election. And then he allowed the many veterans to begin the process of taking over land. I think, this is a question that's very important to the future of that country. It's not just a question of redistribution of land. It's also the question of maintaining a viable economy now that can provide jobs for people and improve the quality of their life. And what he has done, initially he threatened his economy. Then next he caused the collapse of his economy by the process in which he engaged in what is obviously a public good. And the point I'm saying is that he needed to find a process that could serve both goods. Continued attraction of foreign investment, because they need foreign investment in order to provide jobs, but at the same time, providing land distribution for the people who were illegally taken from their land. Yes.
In what way have you seen, or do you feel that structural adjustment policies, which are usually tied to foreign aid, have actually had a more despairing role in creating a greater disparity between the rich and the poor in Africa?
Well, the first thing I have to say, when we talk about the African continent, we're talking about 52 countries. And there's a tendency to talk about Africa as if it was one nation. When Hillary Clinton came to visit me, she said she had been asked before she left what was the capital of Africa. That sort of is the perception of a lot of people have. So to answer your question, I can't talk about the whole continent in the same way, because countries like South Africa have resources, they have a lot of natural resources, they have human resources that can be put to the aid of development in different ways from a country like Rwanda or Burundi or some of the other countries. The truth of the matter is I don't particularly like conditionality on foreign assistance. I think you work with the local people And together you come up with a strategy for development, and then that's what you support. And this notion of providing conditions or strings to aid is not one I have found very helpful. You can provide advice and counsel when you work together to determine those strategies for development. But I don't like personal conditionality. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, is to say that my personal opinion, in some places it might work, in other places it hasn't. Yes.
Ambassador Joseph, you spoke earlier about the public perception or the fact of the United States' minute amount of foreign aid and assistance to developing countries, and also the public perception that it's too much and it ought to be less. How would you reply to, I guess, a lot of citizens of America that think or believe that this assistance should be lower because of the fact that there are poor people in America? There are those who lack, proper health care and assistance within our own nation.
Yeah. One of the jobs I had that I didn't refer to was president of the Council on Foundation. It was an organization of about 2,000 American grant-making foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and I was president. And I was a strong advocate for programs to alleviate poverty abroad. And that's the question I used to get. Why are you emphasizing dealing with poverty abroad when there's poverty here? Because of the interconnectedness, because of the interdependence. I mean, national borders don't mean what they used to. I mean, in a basically post-national society, these things cannot be seen in isolation. And so it's not a question of either or. I mean, it's a question of how do we do both? Obviously, I would not be in favor of completely neglecting poverty here because you're going to deal with poverty there. But what I'd like to see is us try to eliminate poverty here and there. And there are the resources in the world to do that. And we know how to do it, but we don't have the will. And so the real question is, how do we mobilize the American will to try to do both? And not just in what we do in the public sector, but what we do in the private and philanthropic sector. When I was president of Council on Foundation, I was able to get American foundations to give an amount that reached $50 million a year to South Africa. But they were giving far more than that in the United States, while AID was only doing about 50 million. And so, as I said, it's not either or, but it's both and. Yes, I saw a hand here. Yes.
Earlier, Ambassador, earlier we were talking about Zimbabwe and their land redistribution policies. I was also interested on what your observations and thoughts were regarding their latest election and outside countries attempting to influence it, perhaps for the better.
Well, I can't say any more than what the Commonwealth Committee, composed of the presidents of Australia, Nigeria, and South Africa said. And they said in their report to the Commonwealth that it was flawed. And it appears to me to have been flawed. Yes.
My question refers to what you were speaking about earlier in terms of a new realism towards capitalism or towards globalization, and that it doesn't, even that with democracy doesn't by itself relieve poverty. What I've noticed, especially in Latin America, but probably in other parts of the world, is that in response to the fact that it hasn't alleviated poverty, a lot of the forces that are trying to reform those countries are looking to pretty much dispose of capitalism wholesale and also democracy, and to insulate their country from the rest of the world. I'm wondering how foreign aid could further development in the face of that kind of opposition.
Yeah. No, I want you to understand clearly, in my pointing out the deficits in democracy, no one should assume that I'm opposed to advances in democracy. I'm just being a realist and say there are these deficits. And what you've cited is examples of what happens in countries that we are now celebrating as having turned to democracy, who could easily dismantle that in the next few years because of their frustration with the fact that democracy didn't deliver on their expectations. And there's nothing quite like high hopes and then dashed hopes and the frustration that comes from it. And that's what you begin to see now. I think what we need is, first of all, a sensitivity to those dynamics on the part of our foreign assistance people, and a recognition that we have to work with them to develop development strategies, or democracy itself is at risk. And I think if it's put in that kind of language, there might be more support from some of the people who oppose to foreign assistance. I mean, what we now have in situations like that is a threat to the gains that have been made in the advances of democracy. And if they really are for the triumph of the tenets of democracy, then they really ought to support foreign assistance so that democracy can work. And that's really what we're talking about. How do you make democracy work in such a way that the poorest of the poor sees the benefit of that political system? And I think, first of all, you start with that kind of sensitivity, and then you begin to develop strategies for foreign aid that works with indigenous people, with local people, to develop those strategies together. And I don't think you impose a lot of conditions on that. The South Africans, you know, when I was, again, in South Africa, there was a bill making its way through Congress that was going to provide special exemptions for South African goods and traders and that sort of thing. And it had conditions on it that the country had to be a democracy in order to receive this kind of assistance. And South Africa, which was next door to Swaziland, and actually Swaziland is a landlocked country within the borders of South Africa, where they have a kingdom, realized that Swaziland would not be able to get that assistance. And if Swaziland didn't develop, those people were coming into South Africa seeking jobs in a country that has an unemployment rate already of almost 30%. And so they oppose conditionality. And that's one of the reasons I oppose it too. Yes, I see lots of hands, and I know we're going to be coming. You'll tell me when we're... 10 minutes. Okay, fine. I seem to have an affinity for the back, so why don't I start with the front?
Is on the issue of African unity, like I believe it's called the Organization of African Unity, in terms of the discussion between Libya and South Africa as to, I think it was the headquarters of where this organization is going to be, or where a conference is going to be held.
Gaddafi was the one who proposed that they move away from an OAU, an Organization of African Unity, to an African Union. But because he proposed it, don't give him total ownership of what it's developed since. Thabo Mbeki and South Africa and the president of Nigeria have taken the lead in the development and the transformation from an OAU to an African Union. And they've developed a plan called NEPAD, which is a plan for the economic development of the continent. And it's a very good plan. And the present administration has endorsed it, has supported it. How much money they put behind it, I don't know. But I don't think the headquarters is likely to be in Tripoli, but I mean, Gaddafi will probably give him a lot of money, and so it might be useful to put some branches there. But it's not centrally located in terms of the continent. Yes. Back here.
Thank you for speaking today, Ambassador. My question is, you discussed Kofi Annan's quote that the poor have too little globalization in this world. I wonder if you could speak to that a little more, especially in light of the extreme power of multinational companies.
Hey, remember I said that there were downsides, so don't. But when I talk about too little, they have too little of the benefits of globalization, whether it's the technology, and they're not connected to the rest of the world. And so therefore they're entrepreneurs. Even though they have small entrepreneurs, they cannot market their products in the same way as the people who are connected to the rest of the world have the technology and can market products. So you spend time helping develop small enterprises, micro-lending programs and that sort of thing, and they don't work because they don't have the technology. That's a benefit of globalization that they need to have. There are other benefits as well. They're not wired in, even in terms of television. So they don't have the benefits of some of the things, though you can talk about a lot of downsides to them having television, but they don't have the benefits of that either. They don't have the benefits of some of the global trading options that occur. So they have, these are the problems that they have to deal with. And the real problem is that the countries, that are globalizing are dealing with those who are benefiting, but they're not really dealing with those who are not benefiting. And so it's not just a problem from the outside, it's a problem locally as well in terms of the impact of globalization. But I really do think when you look at it, there are a lot of advantages to globalization that we would want them to have, rather than simply dwelling on the disadvantages. Yes.
A question I had is that I know you focus mostly on aid as a
Well, soft power was one of my 4 observations.
okay.
Maybe I spend more time on that. Yes.
But I know that what a lot of developing countries are asking for, what they consider more important than any kind of developmental assistance, is having access to first world markets to sell, for example, textiles or agricultural goods.
Yep. I tried to stick to 25 minutes, and even at that, I went beyond it. But obviously, it's not aid or trade, it's aid and trade. And in South Africa, I was even more of an advocate for trade than I was for aid, because it's got to be both. And the countries I cited, as having developed and having progress, were the countries that have had both aid and trade. And the reason some of the countries have fallen behind is because they've had only aid and only a little amount of aid, and they've not had the advantages of trade. So I agree that it's aid and trade, and both are aspects of soft power. Yes.
You talked about foreign aid without the support of private investment. What are some of the effective strategies that you've seen to sort of promote private investment in some of the countries?
Well, a country like South Africa can market itself as a country that has infrastructure, whether you're talking about roads, whether you're talking about ports, or whether you're talking about financial infrastructure, physical infrastructure, financial infrastructure. It has resources. It has a quality of life. I mean, South Africa is a country that has elements of both the first world and the third world. And so it has all of the elements of the first world. And it is because of the possibility of using those first world elements to develop the third world elements that makes it an attractive investment destination. Also, there's a high rate of return. And many of the corporate leaders in South Africa, when they briefed delegations of American corporations and potential investors visiting, they discouraged them. And when I debriefed them, I said, did you ask them about the return on profits? I mean, if you look at the bottom line, they were doing exceedingly well, but they found all those reasons to complain about why those other investors ought not to come in. Part of it was competition. Part of it was the fact that they just could not see the advantages. Because if you live in South Africa and you go to South Africa and you say, are things better? And the folks who have never had water, who've never had electricity, whose kids studied on the trees, and who had to pay for textbooks when the other kids didn't, for them, life is so much better. But if you had all those things, including good health care and that sort of thing, nothing's changed. Well, that's the good of it, but it depends on the perspective from which you're coming. And so there are people who say to potential investors, well, this is not as attractive as you think, because nothing has really changed for them and they don't want any competitors. But there are lots of reasons. The South African ambassador to the United States and I had worked out 10 reasons for investing in South Africa. But now, when you begin to talk about some of these other countries that are landlocked, that don't have natural resources, don't have infrastructure, don't have skills, then you got to provide foreign assistance to help them develop the skills. You train them so that they can be an advantage for the investor to come in. You help to identify whatever resources are there so that you can develop it in whatever ways you can. I mean, these are the kinds of things that have to take place. But South Africa is very different. I mean, it's the entry, not only, it has 42 million people, there are 120 million in Southern Africa, and there are more than 500 million in the continent. And one of the things I used to say to investors is that South Africa is the entry to the markets of the 120 million and the more than 500 million. And so you come in through South Africa and you develop that access. So I guess I've answered your question more in marketing South Africa than in marketing the continent, yes.
In your work, I'm guessing you come across lawyers from time to time, and I was wondering if you could talk to us about the role that you see lawyers playing in this landscape, and where, in your view, you think they're most effective in advancing international development.
Well, the truth of the matter is I lived for 20 years in the Washington, D.C. area, and I kind of got the impression that almost every other person I met was a lawyer. But then once I probed beyond that, they were people with law degrees who were doing a variety of things. And so they weren't all practicing law. And as a matter of fact, when I look back on the various jobs I've had, every job I had, I succeeded as a lawyer, and I don't have a law degree. My graduate degree is, professional degree is something else. But I think the wonderful thing about the degree in law is it provides you the opportunity to pursue a variety of areas. I mean, for those who want to practice law and go to Washington and compete with all those other lawyers and be one of that legal culture that exists there, that's fine. But there are others, just take philanthropy, for instance. There are so many legal issues that have to be dealt with. Every foundation, of which there are thousands, has to have a legal counsel, to help them work their way through the maze of nonprofit law. When you talk about the more than 1 million nonprofit organizations in this country, a lot of them can't afford full-time legal counsel, but many of them also have to deal with the maze of laws governing non-governmental organization. The same thing is true in business. I spent 10 years as a senior officer of a multinational corporation, and I frequently had to consult not only our general counsel, but outside legal advice for the kinds of things I did both domestically and internationally. And so I guess the point I'm making is the advantage that you have with a law degree is that you can go anywhere and that you're not restricted to one narrow area. Yes.
Ambassador Joseph, can you briefly speak about the interconnectedness of HIV/AIDS and poverty in South Africa?
Very good question. And we could spend the next 15 minutes or so on that. HIV/AIDS in South Africa is a pandemic that has afflicted about 10% of the population of the 42 million. Though I read a front page story in the Washington Post once that said 20% of South Africans were infected by HIV/AIDS. And then near the end of the story, it talked about 4 million people. And so if you got 42 million, it's obviously not 20%. So this gets distorted out of perspective sometimes in this country. But 10% is a lot. And it's a serious problem because it's not just a health problem, it's an economic problem. And when I look at the percentage of young people who are affected by HIV/AIDS, it begins to grow considerably beyond the 10%. And so those are people who will not be able to contribute to the development of that country. Now, the relationship to poverty. Thabo Mbeki made the statement it was distorted, and I won't spend time defending Thabo, except that I do that. And I want you to know that he has been often misunderstood and his perspective distorted. It's poor people who basically, who most often are affected by HIV/AIDS. And that's because they don't have education, they don't have information, they don't have the condoms, they don't have all the other kinds of preventive things. And so there is a direct correlation between poverty and the folks in South Africa affected by HIV/AIDS. That's what Thabo Mbeki had to say, or initially said. Unfortunately, he never came forward and clarified it. I mean, he's got a problem with the press. I will admit that. He doesn't like the press. In our system of government, we would have had a PR firm to set the record straight, and we would have had a spin doctor to make sure that wherever he traveled that this was understood. But this is not the way he operates. And so, unfortunately, some of the things he said about the connection between HIV/AIDS and poverty were distorted out of perspective. I would say that there is a correlation. Because so many of the people who are affected are poor people. Now, the other thing, since I talked about Thabo Mbeki, and a lot of you seem to know, let me just give you one other example, since I say I often try to interpret him. When he called a meeting of dissidents and the sort of orthodox theorists about the connection between HIV and AIDS, he was criticized in the American press for giving a voice to the dissidents. What the Americans didn't understand is that he was operating out of a different paradigm of leadership, and his actions were being interpreted out of a Western paradigm. There is in the coastal tradition the notion of an undaba, where when people disagree, you bring the dissidents and the Orthodox together and you talk it out until there's consensus. In his effort to do that as president of the country, where he brought them together, we were looking at it from a Western perspective, and he said, my God, he's giving credibility to the dissidents that they don't deserve, rather than seeing in his paradigm of leadership, you always bring the dissidents together with the other folks, and you sit around and you talk it out. And that's just a good example of understanding how cultural differences, how you got to understand the cultural context of an issue before you form the kind of conclusions that our press do. And particularly in South Africa, unless you understand the tradition, unless you understand what happened before, you can't understand what's happening now. And I think that's a good example. I'm pleased that you're interested in the rest of the world, and it's been a delight to talk to you.